On the evening of the 29th of December 1170, the Archbishop of Canterbury was murdered in his own cathedral by 4 knights said to be sent by the king. After he fell, one of the knights swung his weapon downwards, cutting off the top of the Archbishop's skull and breaking his sword tip on the stones of the cathedral floor. Within 3 days, news had reached the King of England. His erstwhile friend turned bitter enemy was dead. Hello and welcome. My name's Philip, and in this series I'll be telling the story of Thomas Becket, his rise to prominence, his fall from grace, and his transformation into one of the most famous and venerated saints that Europe had ever seen. Along the way, we'll try to understand the man behind the legend, his motivations, his flaws, and the relationships he formed. Thomas Becket was born around 1120, either on or shortly before the 21st of December, the feast day of St. Thomas the Apostle, for whom he may have been named. We don't know for certain, as these details weren't really recorded. And why should they be? Thomas wasn't royalty. He wasn't the son of a nobleman or a famous knight. His father was a merchant named Gilbert. Gilbert Becket and his wife Matilda were Normans who had immigrated to London sometime prior to Thomas's birth. Though much smaller than today, London was still a medieval metropolis, a bustling centre of trade and commerce, a cultural melting pot that attracted people from all across Europe. We can't say precisely why the Beckets decided to leave their home in Normandy, but Gilbert appeared to be a man with ambition, and clearly London was the place to be. The Beckets lived on Cheapside, the main east-west thoroughfare and the mercantile heart of the city. London at the time was enjoying a period of sustained growth and prosperity, and the Beckets felt the benefit. Gilbert had an entrepreneurial spirit that saw him become an active member of the civic community. In the 1130s, he was elected to the post of Port Reeve, elevating his family's social standing and giving him more authority and political connections. The Port Reeve was responsible for collecting court fees and tolls levied on the market and harbour, and the Becket family often played host to various other sheriffs and wealthy merchants. They soon became the perfect example of that relatively new phenomenon for the period, the upwardly mobile middle class, the nouveau riche of the 12th century. Gilbert's social climb opened more opportunities for his son. Thomas would have stayed at home and been taught by his mother at first, but around the age of 10 he was sent to Merton Priory in Surrey to continue his education, before returning to London to attend a different school a few years later. Around 1138, Gilbert Becket's successful career afforded his son the chance of a lifetime to take up studies in the most desirable city of learning Europe had to offer, Paris. Although the University of Paris was yet to formally exist, the city was still famous for the renowned scholars and artists and architects who lived and taught there. A series of monastic and cathedral schools provided students the opportunity to learn from many different masters, and young Thomas Becket was placed under the tutelage of the English scholar Robert de Melun, who taught the art of reasoning and debate. Becket, in fact, studied a program of 7 liberal arts: the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. This program was intended to provide him with a strong academic foundation for a career in administration, but the Parisian masters were also famous for encouraging a sharp, philosophical mind and spirit of inquiry, tools which Thomas would put to effective use in the years to come. Around 1141, Thomas returned to London, though it's unclear why. 3 years was not long enough to complete his curriculum, and so he must have abandoned his studies for whatever reason. Perhaps he had grown tired of the Paris curriculum. Perhaps he felt he had learned all that he needed. Or it could even have been some personal reason. We can only guess. No matter the case, he utilised his new credentials to begin working for a London financier named Osbert Huitonier. Such a career would have been perfectly respectable, and could well have been the end of Thomas's story, were it not for a remarkable chance. You see, chroniclers of the time record that 2 officials serving in the household of the newly consecrated Archbishop of Canterbury, a man named Theobald, were passing through London and needed somewhere to stay. Well, of course, they chose to lodge with the widely respected and well-connected Gilbert Becket and his family. Whilst there, they were impressed by the bold, ambitious young man fresh from studying in Paris. And so, when the new Archbishop asked for recommendations of who to employ in his household, well, they suggested the sharp-minded son of their gracious host. Suddenly, the boy from Cheapside was thrust into the heights of political discourse. Theobald was the highest-ranking churchman in England, an active administrator and mediator. King Henry I had died in 1135, and so the new archbishop had to negotiate the political quagmire of civil war we now call the anarchy. To aid him in this, Theobald had assembled a household of promising, Paris-educated clerks to assist him in all personal and professional concerns, including the management of episcopal estates and representing him on official business. Serving in the household would have been incredibly demanding, but equally beneficial, giving Thomas access to luxuries far beyond the reach of a London financier. Theobald paid for Thomas to receive further training, sending him across Europe to Auxerre and Bologna, where he studied both civil and ecclesiastical law, and several times to the papal curia in Rome. It was in Theobald's household that Thomas also formed relationships that would define his later life. John of Salisbury, who had studied in Paris at the same time as Thomas, proved a loyal friend and supporter, later dedicating his famous book Polycraticus to him. 2 other members of the household, Roger de Pont-l'Evêque and John of Canterbury, formed a pact with Thomas to help further one another's careers, though Roger reportedly grew resentful of Theobald's favouritism to Thomas. In later years, this rivalry would bear ill fruit. When Roger was elected Archbishop of York, Thomas was given his previous post as Archdeacon of Canterbury, and a position worth £100 per year, a massive sum at the time. What's more, the position made Thomas one of the secular clergy, gaining the benefits of a clerical position while still being free to own property, carry arms, and not make any vows of obedience. In 1153, the conflict of the anarchy began to give way to negotiation. King Stephen's wife and son had both passed away, while Henry Fitz-Empress, having taken up his mother's cause, had sailed to England with the support of his new wife, the powerful Eleanor of Aquitaine. Throughout the year, mediators, including Theobald and Thomas, worked tirelessly back and forth between the two magnates in order to secure peace. Eventually, they were successful, with King Stephen remaining as king but naming Henry as his sole heir. He didn't have to wait long, as Stephen fell ill and died in October 1154. On the 19th of December that same year, Theobald crowned King Henry II and his wife, Queen Eleanor, at Westminster Abbey. It was a lavish ceremony that Thomas surely attended. I can't help but wonder what he thought whilst watching the 21-year-old king. If he had an inkling then, just how much they would define one another's legacies. Following the coronation, there was a current of concern within the church regarding the new king. First of all, he was young and inexperienced. He could lead an army, but could he govern a country? Secondly, he was already surrounded by courtiers who made no secret of their dislike of the church's liberties. Because of these concerns, Archbishop Theobald recommended the king appoint a new chancellor, someone Theobald knew and trusted and had worked with closely before. Within months, or possibly even days of the coronation, Thomas Becket was named Chancellor of England. Although Thomas was 13 years older than Henry, contemporary accounts tell us they got on remarkably well. Both were well educated, capable, ambitious, and enjoyed the finer things in life. Henry had an almost frantic energy. He was constantly on the move and adored hunting, but he was not frivolous. He had a keen interest in the law, and his first priority as king was to restore the rule of law to how it had been under his grandfather, essentially undoing all of Stephen's changes. He issued a Charter of Liberties in 1154, also known as the Coronation Charter, and in the years to come, Thomas would serve as witness to many royal charters. Indeed, as Chancellor, Thomas was directly responsible for the royal scriptorium where the writs and charters were produced, the royal archives, and the King's Chapel. Furthermore, he held the other part of the King's Great Seal and attended all the King's councils without requiring a summons first. In almost all regards, he was considered the second highest ranking person in England after the King. The following 7 years were defined by Thomas's good relationship with the King. As Chancellor, he performed his duty perfectly, supporting and guiding his overlord in all matters. It no doubt helped that the two got on so well. The chancellorship and the king's favour allowed Thomas to indulge in the highest extravagance, dressing in rich imported silks, maintaining a large and splendid household, hosting visiting dignitaries, and enjoying wealthy secular pastimes such as hunting and playing chess. In 1158, he was sent on state business to the court of the King of France, Louis VII, seeking to arrange a marriage between Louis's daughter Margaret and King Henry's son, who was also named Henry. Becket was described by contemporaries as
"He was prepared to display the opulence of England's luxury."
And he brought with him 24 personal changes of clothes, over 200 mounted members of his household, a menagerie of birds, monkeys, and other exotic animals, and a huge supply of English beer, carried on 8 massive horse-drawn carriages. The beer was intended as a response to the French wine the king's court took so much pride in. Of course, such shows of extravagance had their detractors. Becket was widely regarded as more worldly than clerical, and his behaviour during this period was described as boastful and flamboyant. One of his biographers, Garnier de Pont-Saint-Maxence, characterised him as
one who lived a life of ostentatious extravagance.
Furthermore, as Chancellor, he assisted the king in matters of warfare. In 1159, he led an army in Toulouse and successfully seized a number of towns. In 1161, he again led troops in Gisors. Dismayed at hearing his protégés engaging in such behaviour, Archbishop Theobald wrote to Thomas, begging him to return to England. Now, if such disapprovals had an effect on Thomas, he didn't show it. He was doing his duty as the king's chancellor, a role he excelled at, and whilst the king was at his back, he couldn't show any concern. The cries from the clergy, the implications that he had somehow betrayed them, fell on deaf ears, or at least that's what they thought. Later that same year, Archbishop Theobald passed away. Despite the rift that had grown between them, Thomas must have been affected. His mentor of several years, the man who had seen his potential and nurtured it, supporting him, taking him into his household, and pushing him to excel. The man who had intervened to get him the position of Chancellor. The man who had perhaps the greatest influence on his life and career was dead. And the last thing he had said to Thomas was asking him to change his ways. I can't even imagine what was going through Thomas's mind when King Henry, his friend and benefactor, asked him to become the new Archbishop of Canterbury. Henry thought it was a great idea. Of course he did. He had come up with it, after all. If his Chancellor was also Archbishop, then through him, the two could exercise royal authority on both church and state. It was, of course, controversial. Henry's mother, the Empress Matilda, counselled against it, and Becket at first refused. It took Henry of Pisa, a visiting cardinal, to speak with Thomas and convince him to accept the role. The king put forward his recommendation of Thomas to a council of bishops and the monks of Canterbury, and after lengthy debate, they at last acquiesced. As a member of the secular clergy, Thomas had never actually been ordained as a priest, and so that was the first order of business. The ordination took place on the 2nd of June 1162, and just 24 hours later, the new priest was formally consecrated as Archbishop in Canterbury Cathedral. 15 bishops oversaw as Thomas Becket was seated upon the episcopal throne and presented with his symbols of office, his mitre, crozier, and ring. Finally, he sent envoys on his behalf to Rome to receive a pallium from the Pope. Only archbishops and the Pope himself were allowed to wear the pallium, and it represented the conferral of full jurisdiction upon Thomas. In accepting it, he swore an oath of ultimate obedience to the papacy. It was in this oath Thomas revealed a conflict of interests that would eventually spell his doom. This is perhaps the most defining moment of Becket's life. A moment that has been debated and discussed by historians for centuries. Following the elaborate ceremony of the consecration, the solemnity of the oath, and no doubt with the memory of Theobald weighing heavily on his mind, Thomas appears to have undergone a spiritual transformation. Perhaps the significance of his new role suddenly struck home. Perhaps he had begun to consider his own legacy and place in the world. Perhaps he knew that if he took on this responsibility, he needed to commit to it fully, mind, body, and soul. Contemporary chronicler Roger of Pontigny describes the moment as though Thomas had become an entirely different person, saying that,
"With the aid of divine grace, he was transformed into another man. He put off the old man with his acts, and put on the new man in righteousness and sanctity."
Such a change may have seemed miraculous to many, but to others It was the cruelest and deepest betrayal. Despite King Henry's protests, not long after receiving the pallium, Thomas resigned from his office as Chancellor. Henry's plans for a single powerful ally to expand royal authority came crashing down around him. But worse than that, his closest friend, the man he had given power, money, and glory, had turned his back on him. And he couldn't understand why.